Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 188, and we're going to talk about a bunch of topics. Number one, migration in 1959 versus now, the efficiency department that's going to be run by Elon Musk, and government greed. Oh, all right. My dad came to the United States in 1959 as a student. He did not immigrate. Okay. He came as a student with complete intention to return to Korea once he completed his studies. And maybe I'll talk about that some other time, but there's a lot to talk about. So let's focus on just that migration process, that him coming to the United States in 1959 as a student. In order to come to the United States, he had to prove that he had a way to provide for himself, to pay for his stay here in the United States. And so the easiest way to do that at the time, since Korean nationals were not allowed to just simply come to the United States. Oh, I should say, this was before the repeal of the Johnson-Reed Act, sometimes called the Asian Exclusion Act, depending on your perspective. But the Johnson-Reed Act imposed quotas on countries where you had people who wanted to come to the United States. And the quota was determined, the number of people who were allowed to come to the United States, they were given visas, was determined by the number of citizens you had here in the United States already. So if you had, let's just say, a large number of people here as citizens who were originally from a certain country, then you would give out a lot of visas. But in a place like Korea, where citizenship was not granted to Koreans here in the United States, then no one was allowed. And so, but you had diplomatic relationships with that country. And so you had to have an allowance of certain number of visas for diplomats and other assorted individuals. Turns out they did have positions or visas for students. And so my father came as a student. And so for a very long time, I remember when people would ask him, when did you immigrate? He would correct them very forcefully that he did not immigrate, that he came to study as a student. There is a big difference. And maybe one day you would understand that significance. It was a matter of pride, particularly for him, because he had to pass a very, very difficult entrance exam in Korea, right? So a lot of other Korean students who were coming to seminaries here in the United States, they came based on the recommendation of a missionary. So there was no academic hurdle that they had to get. They didn't even have to speak English. Okay. But my father, because he was sort of a dark horse, as it were, he wasn't playing the favors of missionaries, right? He didn't want to be in the pocket of a missionary or a denomination. And so he came on his own. And so he had to basically prove that he could speak English nearly fluently, in order to basically gain entrance to this particular seminary, which promised to pay not only his tuition, but the room and board. Just FYI, in 1959, the seminary that my father attended was free for, American students, right? Because you train these pastors. So every denomination has a seminary. And the graduates of that seminary would then occupy pulpits in that particular denomination. And so therefore, the denomination would be able to have enough workers and would not begin to shrink. Okay. And so those students did not pay any tuition at all. And I mean, I attended the same seminary. And the tuition, even when I went in the 90s, was very, very low. I think like on the order of $1,000 per semester. Okay. But these days I hear that the tuition is much, much higher. But in any case, so students were one of the exceptions for this restriction of immigration or migration here to the United States. So although he came to the United States as a student, just before he came, he got engaged with my mother. He couldn't bring his mother, obviously, because then he would have to figure out how to support her. And not having been in America before, he didn't know how he was going to provide for her. And so basically, she had to wait for him. So once he graduated seminary here in the United States, I mean, he could see that that was in his future. He got various jobs, and the most readily available job for him as a student was the job of janitor. He cleaned toilets, right? He cleaned toilets at the seminary. And then once he graduated the seminary, because it was the most convenient job, he worked as a janitor at this seminary. But then once he graduated, he found another janitorial job at a factory. And so he would work 8 hours every night. I think it was 12 to 8 shift. Then he would go to classes. Then he was accepted to a doctoral program after seminary. And so he would attend classes during the day and then I guess sleep at some point. I saw a picture of him when he was close towards the end of his doctoral program, and he was a stick. He had lost so much weight. And my mom said that he was really, really unhealthy because he was pushing himself so hard. But that's what you needed to do if you wanted to bring your fiance to the United States. You had to prove that you could support her and family. There was no welfare programs, right? And so he had to work hard and do all of the other things that he wanted to do to be able to live here in the United States. And it was rough, right? So as soon as my mom came, they got married. That's another really long, interesting story. But and then started having kids. And so my parents did not have health insurance. And thankfully, health insurance was not that expensive. And so 63, my mom came in February and my brother was born in November. And so the prenatal care and all that other stuff, they went to an OBGYN and, my dad said they didn't have insurance. And so the doctor said, hey, look, you don't have to pay me. Instead, what you got to do is you got to be the last appointment of the day and you have to give me a lecture on philosophy or religion. So my father was in the religion department of a university, and he was doing his doctorate in philosophy of religion. And so she wanted to hear what he was studying. And so he would gladly did that in exchange for payment of the OBGYN prenatal visit. And so he had all three of us that way. All three of us were born not paying money, but by giving lectures. Okay. So he penny pinched like you would not believe. My mom would sometimes make fun of him. I think I said this before, where he would jump on his bike and ride to the bank to deposit $7. Right. So, I mean, he was penny pinched like crazy, which makes it even more interesting to consider how migration happens today. A lot of people just simply walk across the border, and particularly under knowing that a lot of them, once they cross the border, they automatically get all this money from the government, right? Currency, I should say, from the government, education, health, living, expenses, a place to live. All of this stuff is provided by inflation, right? And so it's kind of crazy. We went in a time period where some people might accuse the United States of being extremely discriminatory, asking people who want to come to the United States to prove that they can support themselves, to now just paying for everyone to come in, making it so easy, in fact, that in Venezuela, all of the prisons were emptied and they were told you can come out of prison as long as you go to the United States. And that's what they did. So it's an economic boom for countries like Venezuela who no longer have to pay for incarceration, right? Keeping people in prison. They don't have to pay for them anymore. Instead, they become a burden here in the United States. Now, obviously, everyone who's coming to the United States are not criminals, but a lot of them are. And the United States government is not really tracking any of them, which is why you see gangs taking over buildings in Colorado, this kind of phenomena where you see lots of gangs, criminal element coming to the United States and just basically, taking over a lot of certain areas of certain cities. It doesn't make any sense to me. I tried to figure out what the logic is to this other than the destruction of life in America as we know it. It just, otherwise it doesn't make sense. I wish that there was some way that all of these people coming into the United States today end up on the lawns of the politicians and the people who are in favor of open borders, who are in favor of this kind of policy. I think that would change their minds very, very quickly, that they would advocate for some sort of criteria for letting people in so that you don't have this huge financial burden, as well as having threats to your personal safety as a result. Anyway, so that's it for that one. I mean, just getting rid of welfare here in the United States would do a lot to sort of make people think twice about coming to the United States. Next on the docket is the Musk Efficiency Department, right? Which is interesting. So the interview on Spaces that Musk had with Donald Trump, they mentioned, an efficiency department, something to slash a lot of jobs in government, or at least the budgets, right? And generally, if you're going to slash the budget, that means a lot of people are going to lose their job. And so Musk suggested it, and Donald Trump said, "Hey, that's a great idea. I mean, you eliminated what, like 80% of Twitter slash X's employment roles, and you guys are doing great. So yeah, that'd be awesome if you can do it for government." And I thought that was an interesting idea. But then I saw a tweet today where, if Trump is elected, he's going to start an efficiency department, Department of Government Efficiency. And so I thought, the first thought I had was, is this going to be like the Space Force, right? A back door to another government agency? So sort of like Homeland Security, right? Because they did such a horrible job protecting America, FBI, CIA, Department of Defense. Since they did such a horrible job defending the United States, we're going to have the Department of Homeland Security, right? That was George W. Bush's grand idea. So more bureaucracy, more government spending, more inflation. So is the efficiency department going to be just like that? Is it going to be like another Space Force? In theory, I guess it would be great, because Musk would just simply hire a handful of people and just systematically go through all of the bureaucracies in government and say, yeah, you can lose 50% of your budget next year, So I hope that Musk does it in Musk fashion. But we all know that nothing is more permanent as a temporary government agency, as said by Milton Friedman. So nothing is more permanent than a temporary government agency. So I could almost see that there is a risk that the efficiency department becomes the largest bureaucracy in government, because their job is so important. So that's always kind of a risk. I hope that it doesn't become another Space Force kind of thing. The final topic of the day is the tax the rich thing. Now, I've talked about this before, but there's just so many, tweets, articles, stories about, once again, taxing the rich, this time through a capital gains tax, which I'm sure if you're listening to me, you already know that the capital gains tax is ridiculous, right? So now you've heard all the other arguments, right? That what if you have a capital gain this year, but as soon as the new year comes around, you suffer a huge loss. Well, that's not taken into consideration because it's in the next fiscal year. And so therefore you still owe taxes on what you gained the previous year. I remember Bitcoin being something like this, right? Where just before the new year, it went up really high. I forget if it was like 20,000 or 60,000. And then the new year came along and it crashed. Well, the problem is, and that would be an easy illustration where you'd have to still pay the capital gains tax from the previous year, but now you have nothing with which to pay it because it crashed in the new year. It doesn't matter because that's not how the government does its accounting. So a lot of people have made that argument, and you're like, yeah, yeah, I heard that. Okay, well, here's something else. Okay, it because of the inflation, everyone who has property will experience a capital gain. That's what's so insane, right? So capital gains taxes, people are not have not really specified whether it's stocks or your house. It might be any possession that you have, right? Your land, your property, your car, the art that's in your house, right? But inflation basically pushes everyone into higher tax brackets, right? I talked about this before, how I believe in World War One, very few people were making a certain amount of money where they would have to pay income tax. But because of inflation, now everyone has to pay income tax. So capital gains tax might seem like, oh, it's only for the extreme rich. But if we get massive inflation, then everyone is going to have to pay capital gains tax. Except the thing is, where is that money to pay the tax going to come from, right? Your wealth is inflated. So you really are not richer than you were before. And if you had to liquidate some of your property to pay that tax, you're left with even less, right? Especially if the price of the assets crash, right, in the new year. And so now you're going to sell these very, stuff which does not have, this is not going to get you a lot of money, but you still have to pay all this tax. And so the new year comes around and you have nothing, right? So imagine having to liquidate your house to pay last year's capital gains tax. But then next year, now you have no property, and so you don't have to worry about that tax. I mean, come on. This is basically the expressway to impoverishing nearly everyone except the politically connected. Now, this whole idea of taxing the rich, you got to ask why. Well, why do you want to tax the rich? Because they're greedy. Well, I made a couple episodes which talked about this idea of greed. Everyone is greedy. If you understand greed to mean not wanting more than you need, because need is subjective, right? Obviously, a billionaire is going to say, my needs are great, right? But that means that everyone who has less than that person, right, is not greedy. So greedy is a pejorative. It means nothing. It's an empty term. Anyone who uses it, they're always thinking about people who have more than them. And that basically is all the information that you get from that term. If someone is using the word greedy, then you know that the person they're calling greedy has more than they do. Okay. And that's all it tells us, really. And so it means nothing, and everyone is greedy. Now, most people in the 50s and 60s had to work to get anything, right? So people might have accused my dad of being greedy because he was saving money to buy a ticket for my mom to come to the United States, right? But this greed, or basically to have more than what you have right now, that's my definition of greed, by the way, to try to have more than what you have now, right? Just in case you got to replace the roof, just in case you have to buy a new car, just in case you need to buy new clothes because your old clothes don't fit anymore, or they have holes in them, or whatever, right? Or you're trying to get married, or you're trying to have kids, so you're trying to save up money. So greed, or basically planning for the future, right? Trying to have more than what you have right now, is incentivized, right? You want to have that because you're planning for the future. And in order to do that, you're going to try to think of better, more creative ways to make money. This is what we were talking about yesterday with the innovation, right? And so you're going to try to be as creative as possible to figure out a way to make the most amount of money with the least amount of effort, honestly. Okay. And so this is where innovation comes. You're going to try to be able to do a lot more using a lot less resources and time. And not to confuse you, but yes, time is a resource. Okay. So a couple of examples of people trying to innovate to try to make money, right? Kids or orphans in Korea during World War II and, excuse me, the Korean War and after the Korean War, a lot of them, because there were a lot of orphans as a result of that war, started making cigarettes out of discarded cigarette butts. And so a lot of the orphans, they would hang around the train stations, people coming off the train or going on the train. They would be smoking and they would throw the butts on the ground. Kids would gather up all of those discarded butts, um, take the unburned tobacco, right? Make the initial investment of buying some rolling paper or just buy a Bible, right? Because Korean Bibles, apparently the rumor was that the paper of Korean Bibles were the best for rolling cigarettes. That's what they said anyway. And so you roll a new cigarette out of all of those discarded tobacco and you sell it, not the same price as a cigarette or a new cigarette, but it's less expensive, and people who weren't as wealthy, they would buy them. And that is how they were able to make money. Is it menial work or is it genius? My mom, when she came to South Korea after walking out of North Korea, and I do mean walking, she made pillows, right? She was walking in the market one day and she saw a lady selling pillows and she said, I can make those pillows. And she started and she figured out how to make pillows and she sold it to the lady at the market. And she was able to not only pay for food, but also tuition for herself and one of her siblings. Okay. So she would pay for the tuition of one of her siblings in turn. And that's how she was able to get some of them educated anyway. And so this desire to make money, right, meant that you had to become creative and producing something, making something to sell to other people so that you can have what you want. Now, this makes government the greediest entity in the world because they do absolutely no work. They just take from everybody, everyone except the people who are connected, like other politicians and what is it, large corporate interests, like the military industrial complex. They take from everybody except for them, or the green energy companies, right? They, even though they make billions of dollars, they're not taxed, right? Because they're doing a great thing for society and the world. So they take from everybody. They're the greatest insider traders that ever existed, right? And so any of us, if we try to trade, buy and sell stocks on some tip or something, we get arrested, just like Martha Stewart, and you go to jail. But politicians do it all the time. They're never busted, and they just simply become millionaires, right? And so government and everyone who is affiliated with government, they spend over $35 trillion, right? They overspend. They don't even keep track of what they're spending. But if any of us spends $601 on anything, then we are now under suspicion. This is completely unsustainable. I think that in addition to anything else, Trump should really audit politicians. Maybe he won't because he'd have to audit himself too, but I think he does everything legally. He's a savvy business person, but most politicians, I think their constituents would not like how they are making so much money off of their purchasing power, right? Through inflation. So the lack of accountability is incredible. If only the people who did evil were punished, then fewer people would do it. I even made the argument a few episodes, I don't know when, one of these episodes, where even psychopaths and sociopaths would be incentivized to do something that is productive rather than destructive. That's it for today. I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I will talk to you next week.